last half an hour a 7 to 8 minute speech that was posted on social media about the reasoning for the United States going to war with Iran. He went through several items going back to the history of the 1979 hostage taking, all the way through to 9/11, and then to the objectives related to eliminating all of Iran's nuclear capabilities. In addition to that, speaking directly to Iranians on the ground, saying that he is listening to them, also saying to Iran's military forces to lay down their arms, and he will give them, in his words, immunity. That all just happening within the last 2 hours. I'm going to go straight down to MSNBC White House reporter Julia Jester. And Julia, we now just were able to play for viewers what we heard in its entirety from the president. Any further details that stand out to you in that?
What is striking to me about the president's comments, first and foremost, is his warning of potential U.S. casualties and attempting to justify that, what he says is a noble mission. Now, he's made it clear that the U.S. is at war with Iran, but Congress has not authorized war with Iran. And while President Trump clearly is seeking regime change, encouraging the Iranian people, once the bombs stop falling, to rise up and take their government, this was an act of war that is quite different than what we saw in Venezuela just last month. With the Venezuela operation to oust the leader there, Maduro, the U.S. said that that was a law enforcement operation and therefore not an act of war and did not require congressional authorization. So these are strikingly different scenarios when it comes to the regime change aspect. As you mentioned, any kind of thought that these strikes could just be a potential warning to get Iran to come to the table to strike a nuclear deal. The president pretty much poured cold water on that with his remarks. And so the fact that he is saying that Iran is posing an imminent threat to the United States, not just a future threat if it obtains a nuclear weapon, shows the lengths with which President Trump is trying to justify this military action in what is quite a risky move. The potentially just ripple effects that could affect his presidency, his legacy, the region, and the world. And so we will be watching closely for reaction from members of Congress to the president's remarks. And we will see just what the level of coordination is between the U.S. and Israel with these strikes, which happened in broad daylight. But I think the idea of regime change, the idea that there may be U.S. casualties, the lives of courageous American heroes may be lost, and that often happens in war. And the fact that the president is speaking in this video, he's currently at Mar-a-Lago. We will wait to hear from potentially other U.S. officials, but this is clearly escalated and will have ripple effects in the region. And keep in mind, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, was just set to go to Israel Monday and Tuesday. The trip was announced on Friday. I have reached out to see if his plans will change, given the situation in the region, given the fact that the Israeli embassy in Jerusalem, the U.S. embassy there, has made an authorized departure. But other embassies in the region, other U.S. embassies in countries, say Qatar and Bahrain, they have not had those. So it remains to be seen how the U.S. is going to protect its citizens abroad amid all of this volatility, and we'll see how this shakes out. Richard.
Thank you so much, Julia. I want to go straight to Edith De La Quatera, MS Now international reporter in Paris for us right now, and we're looking on the left-hand side of your screen for those of you just joining us. The video of a morning attack by Israel. The president, as I was just mentioning, here Ines, has been very clear about what his intentions are. It appears that we have impending major military action to be taken by the United States and what has been called the United States being at war with Iran. The actual kinetic action
some of those strikes this morning were in Tehran. The AP reporting that they appear to be close to the Supreme Leader's offices, that there were, we've seen images circulating showing huge plumes of smoke rising from that area. But Iranian state media is now reporting that there were other explosions in other cities. So they say explosions also rocked Isfahan, Qom, Karaj, and Kermanshah. Isfahan and Qom are especially important. Isfahan, of course, we know there is a big nuclear facility there where Iran stores a lot of its enriched uranium. Qom is also near the Fordo nuclear facility, of course, that massive, heavily fortified underground nuclear facility that was struck this summer. I will say we have been hearing mixed messaging from the administration in recent days with regards to the status of Iran's nuclear program. We had heard from the President's Special Envoy, Steve Witkoff, that Iran was about a week away from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Then we heard from administration officials that that wasn't the case, that the program had been completely obliterated this summer, but that they could be trying to rebuild. So clearly, if there were strikes there in Isfahan and Qom, potentially near the Fordo nuclear facility, it could be that the U.S. and Israel are specifically striking those nuclear facilities. And of course, this comes after we saw this kind of last-ditch effort for diplomacy. We were there in Geneva last week, and just this week, as well as the U.S. and Iran held these indirect talks. Significant that they never actually met face-to-face in the same room. These were indirect talks. So of course, lots of questions as to how much progress could actually be made when they were refusing to meet face-to-face. The talks mediated by Oman. We know there have been significant differences when it comes to that, last-ditch effort for diplomacy. There were a number of points they couldn't agree on. So of course, the level of enrichment was one. We know the U.S. had been pushing for zero enrichment. Iran wanted some enrichment. Iran had maintained it wanted, as a sovereign nation, it had a right to a peaceful civilian nuclear program. There have been mixed messaging on that as well, with the Americans saying they wanted zero enrichment. Then we had heard from the Iranian foreign minister that actually the U.S. hadn't actually asked for that. We know the U.S. also wanted details from what he had to say.
That was absolutely extraordinary from Donald Trump. Remember, in the build-up to this has all been talking about nuclear ambitions, quite in a relatively limited scope of negotiations. That was, in short, a call for regime change. That was essentially sounded to me like a declaration of war against the regime, not necessarily the country, but the regime. He was saying, he finished that statement by saying, people of Iran, essentially rise up, overthrow your government. That was a far broader kind of prospectus than maybe we might have expected given the build-up. To go back to the start of that, I thought it was interesting. He started with a sort of a history lesson, or his perspective on it, of the various things he said the Iranian government had done to America, the various, whether it's from the storming of the embassy shortly after the revolution to the sinking of the USS Cole to the funding of militia in the Middle East. He listed a long list of grievances they had, and then basically went on to say what this action was going to achieve. And I think what was really interesting was the scope of those ambitions. This wasn't just trying to stop the nuclear program, as he'd said. This is destroying the ballistic missile, shattering their industry. He said to the Revolutionary Guard, lay down your weapons, surrender or you will die. I mean, it was very, very broad and very, very strong in its words from the US president.
And he also mentioned the fact that he said that there is the possibility of American soldiers, casualties, dying in this war. This is a very different message from a president who campaigned as an anti-war president.
Yeah, I think he knows that although the Americans and the Israelis have overwhelming firepower against the Iranians, that the Iranians have a huge number of ballistic missiles as well, and US bases in the region are going to be vulnerable. So it's interesting, we talk about this build-up for a long time, and the potential for war, but actually one of the things that analysts said and insiders said is that the reason that the US wouldn't do this 3 weeks or 4 weeks ago is because they didn't have the air defences in place. They do now have far more air defences in place, even though they've got their Patriot missile systems, other defences around. They know that Iranian ballistic missiles will target their bases, will target maybe their allies, will certainly target Israel, and they know that not all of them will be stopped. And excuse me, I think he's preparing the US public for the idea that there will be casualties. I don't think he's not talking. It's important to emphasise that wasn't because American forces will be killed on the ground going into Iran. This is, I think, we're talking about missiles coming back and causing casualties that way.
Gia, your thoughts on the president's statement, as Joe mentioned there, talking about regime change essentially in Iran? How likely is that? How effective can the Americans and Israelis be in that?
Just before answering your question, if an hour ago you would have asked me about this attack, what is the ambition, I might have said maybe this is just putting pressure on Iran to give more in the negotiation. But after his speech, it is very clear the message to security forces to choose between death or living security force, and also asking Iranian people come out and finish the regime once for all. And I think what he said, it seems to me, is a long term. They have been preparing, they have been deploying hardware, military hardware, anti-aircraft, anti-missile defense system to the region. They have been preparing for this. And all the sign was indicating they are preparing to attack Iran. But many people, just a few days ago, they were saying most likely this is for pressuring Iranian to give in more. But I think this is exactly what many Iranians among the opposition were hoping for. They were hoping for the President Trump go in, weaken the security forces, and pave the way for people to come out, just like a month ago, to rise up and finish the regime once for all. And actually, just a few minutes ago, one of the major Iranian opposition figures, Prince Reza Pahlavi, came out and said the promise of President Trump to come to the aid of Iranian people, that moment has come. He has fulfilled his promise, and the time to change the regime is now. And I think all the signs indicating that it might have been planning for the regime change in Iran.
An update that we're getting from the Israeli army at the moment says it's identified missiles being launched from Iran. So this is the Israeli army saying it's identified missiles being launched from Iran. It had been preparing for some kind of retaliatory attack by Iran. Just give us a sense of Iran's capacity to respond militarily to this attack.
Well, Iranian in the past few decades, they have been able to develop their ballistic missiles. Last year, during the June 12 days war, I was in Israel. I witnessed the sheer level of destruction of those missiles. Those missiles could penetrate the Israeli system, and numbers of them hit the ground, and the level of destruction was massive. Iranians say they have used supersonic missile, which is capable of passing through the defense system. And Iran also have a short-range missile, have a drone capacity, which Russia has used against Ukraine. Iranian gave them shot drones. And I think they have that kind of capacity. The question is whether Israel or America be able to attack the launching pad. That's exactly what Israel did last year. They were attacking the launching pad. From the moment those mobile launching pads were moving, they were attacking them, reducing the Iranian capacity to attack Israel, or possibly at this point of time, most likely U.S. bases also could be the target for Iranian security forces and Iranian missiles. And we know they have the capacity. In the past few days, the commander of Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the commander of Iranian army, they have threatened if United States stop the war, we will respond with a force never seen before. But we have to wait to see exactly what kind of force, what kind of weapons they have in their hand. They can confront American and Israelis at this point of time.
Yes, Joe, what do you make of that, considering the military presence already there in the region?
I think what you said is exactly right, but there's one other thing I think to add to that. It's really important to remember that the US, whilst it has these very sophisticated air defense systems, as does Israel, the number of interceptors they have is comparatively small compared to the huge number of ballistic missiles that the Iranians have. So while they have the capacity to defend themselves, they don't. If eventually their stocks of interceptor missiles will start to be degraded, probably faster than the Iranian ballistic missiles would run out if they don't destroy them on the ground. So that's going to be the really important thing for the Americans and the Israelis to be kind of aiming to do here, will be, as Gilles says, to take out those launch pads. Because if there is a sustained ballistic missile campaign from Iran, eventually they will start to get through with greater numbers, and the consequences of that could be very severe for the Americans and the Israelis.
Joe Inwood and Gia Gold, thank you so much for bringing us the very latest on that here in the studio. Well, let's look
live to Doha now and speak to our correspondent there, Barbara Pett Usher. And Barbara, Doha is one of those areas, Qatar, one of those countries that would be worried about any potential Iranian response.
Yes, especially because Qatar was the one Arab country that was hit during the 12-day war because it hosts the biggest American air base in the region, the El Udeid military base, which is essentially the forward base or headquarters for the Central Command. It's the hub for all the big air operations in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan, for their logistics. About 10,000 troops there, a lot of aircraft stationed there. Last time, Catherine, you remember that the Iranians targeted Al Udeid, but they signaled very much ahead of time that they were going to do so, and all of those missiles were shot out of the air. So it was kind of performative. It was sort of an indication or a message being sent. And they've made very clear this time that that's not going to be the case, that they are ready to strike U.S. military bases throughout the region. And there are 13 of them throughout the region, here in Qatar and Bahrain, in the UAE, in Iraq and Syria, and elsewhere as well. So they have said that they are ready to strike them directly without any forward warning. In fact, the Iranian officials have been saying we made a mistake last time, actually. We were too slow, we were too careful. Now look what we're facing, and that's not going to happen again. Now, from satellite images we've seen over the last couple of days, it looks as if, especially in Bahrain, where you have the naval fleet, the 5th Naval Fleet there, and also here in Al Udeid, the aircraft and the ships have been moved out. The satellite images are showing that the areas are quite empty. We also have reports that troops have been moved out as well, although we don't have concrete details on how many and to where. But this is quite critical for the administration, for the Trump administration, because polls have shown that the American public has a very low tolerance for American casualties. And definitely, if there are going to be American casualties, many of them would come from strikes on the military bases here. So the Americans, the administration has been shipping anti-aircraft defenses to these places, as well as we've talked many times about the military firepower that it has amassed in the Gulf. But still, President Trump did warn that Americans might die. He's gauging there whether the American public will be able to absorb that. And clearly his message, his long speech there, was to try to justify going back to all of America's grievances with Iran, actually, rather than focusing on why it might be necessary right now from a security point of view for the Americans to do this, signaling that they may be hearing about some casualties.
And Barbara will continue to monitor the reaction in the region. We are looking at these flight radar images which show that the airspace across Iran and Iraq is closed at the moment. You mentioned there Iran's strike on Qatar last year, the fact that it was highly signaled, it was choreographed essentially. This time around, are those channels of communication open, do we know? And is there a sense that the region is in uncharted territory at the moment?
The region is in uncharted territory at the moment. Now, certainly, the regional leaders have done everything they could to keep those channels of communication open over the past 2 months. There's been enormous diplomatic activity, calls, many calls, visits to Iran, visits by Iranian officials to Qatar and other areas. The regional leaders speaking with the Americans, trying to tap down the pressure, trying to find a way out of this. The most recently, of course, you had the Iranian foreign minister, which has been mediating in these nuclear talks, taking a quick trip to the U.S. to meet with the vice president and saying, look, we actually do have a breakthrough in these talks. The Iranians have agreed that they would not keep any enriched uranium on their soil. They would move their stockpile immediately. That's a breakthrough. So they've been doing everything they can because they are worried about what might happen. They are aware that Iran is weakened. It's not as strong as it was a couple of years ago, but it does have a very large, still ballistic missile store, short and medium range missiles, which means that they are in range as well as Israel. They're worried beyond that, that if this was going to be perceived as an existential threat, which I think we can say quite confidently, it will be, given what President Trump just said, that the Iranians might target not just the U.S. bases, but they might target directly oil and gas infrastructure, which is of course the lifeblood of the petrostates here. That they might close the Strait of Hormuz, which is this narrow waterway where much of the oil shipments go through. And so that has been something that's a great deal of concern. You've actually had in recent days seen countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates increase their oil shipments, their oil exports, presumably because they were worried that this might come to pass. We don't have any information about what sort of talks, what sort of channels might be open at this stage between, say, Qatar and other regional leaders with the Iranians. The supreme leader, as we've heard, is not in Tehran. He's gone into hiding again. It's not clear how accessible people are. We have a report from the semi-official Iranian news agency that thousands of Revolutionary Guards have been killed and wounded. So it sounds as if it might be a little bit difficult to organize communication on that level. But it is something that is they are watching very closely here. I would add, Catherine, that I mentioned that if there are American casualties, they would be at these bases. There are a lot of Americans in Qatar. There are close ties between Qatar and the United States. The Georgetown University, from whom you had a guest recently, he was in Qatar. That's the Georgetown, the Qatar branch of the university. I think there are thousands of them here. And the U.S. Embassy issued a statement saying it had urged all of its personnel to shelter in place, and that the American citizens should do the same. I'm not aware that it issued a warning mandating people to leave. There has not been a great deal of information about people being told that they needed to depart because of the imminent threats.
Barbara, just looking at Iran's influence across the region in Lebanon, in Yemen, what kind of conversations are people having about the potential unraveling of Iran's influence in the region?
Well, Iran's influence in the region has been unraveling, Catherine, since the beginning of the October War, because the Israelis have gone further out from their boundaries, and they have attacked Hezbollah, as you know, and very much weakened it with constant strikes, killing the leader as well. They have weakened Syria, or there has been Bashar al-Assad's regime was weakened to the extent that it fell. So the militias there, the Iranian-sponsored militias there, have been weakened. There are pro-Iran militias in Iraq, which have been keeping a low profile in recent conflicts. They did not raise their heads during the 12-day war. They did, however, say that they would be prepared to get more active in this one if it should start, and that if it was existential, that is, if the supreme leader was targeted, that they would then for sure get involved. You've also had the Houthis. They have continued to send missiles towards Israel. I think that we could imagine that they will also perhaps become a part of the Iranian response to this strike, this attack on
Barbara, thank you. That's our correspondent Barbara Pletz-Asher in Doha there. Well, let's now speak to Ahmed Mahmoudyan, Middle East analyst and research fellow at the University of South Florida's Global and National Security Institute. Thank you for joining us on BBC News. Just give us a sense of what you're making of the events over the last few hours.
Well, given the scale of the attack, and more specifically the places that they targeted in Tehran, which is largely in center, east, and also somewhat in the south of the Tehran, it seems that most of the attacks so far haven't been concentrated necessarily on military apparatus, but on the highest echelon of the Iranian political and intelligence leadership. Reports suggested that the presidential office been targeted, the office of supreme leader been targeted, the intelligence service itself been targeted. So, I mean, if we put this together with the President Trump's speech, this is going to be a regime change campaign.
Well, that is the command and control headquarters of the IRGC in Tehran. Now, that was just an initial reading. We don't know what the battlefield assessment is. We don't know if there was anyone in the building at the time and what may have been the result of those strikes. We know that the Israeli Prime Minister as well has released a statement team is saying. They're saying that what they're saying, excuse me, the Iranian president, according to the Iranian news agency, has not been targeted. He is, at least according to the Iranian news agency, still in control. That is not necessarily a significant thing because the Iranian president does not oversee the Iranian military, the armed forces, the same way that the United States does in terms of its command and control structure. But nonetheless, a symbolic figure because of the fact that he was previously targeted in an operation last year during the 12-day war between Iran, Israel, and the United States. But in terms of the scope of the operation and what this operation entails, nobody in the region has a clear sense of that. I've spoken to a few people now this morning, and they're all watching this. Obviously, there have been preparations made across the Gulf, including in countries like Qatar, as well as Bahrain, where the U.S. Naval Ship Fleet is headquartered. Qatar, of course, has Central Command headquarters there in the region. So a lot of preparations have been put in place, but now the question is whether or not the Iranian regime is capable of responding and whether or not it will respond immediately. It has signaled it will respond, but as of yet, I know you were mentioning earlier that there were air raid sirens going off in Israel. No official announcement from the Iranian government that they have been able to launch any kind of retaliatory strike right now on the state of Israel.
Eamon, I'm sure if you can still hear us, having some technical difficulties. But I wanted to get your sense of the president's speeches. He had listed about a dozen different objectives here, or points as to why he was moving forward with major military operations there in Iran. Did anything stand out to you? Did anything change? What was different, if anything, from what was being heard up to this early Saturday morning from your view?
Well, it's clear from the U.S. president, and look, a lot of people are going to try to parse his words and try to interpret what he said, but the most important thing for me is what he said at the end of his speech, at the end of his comments. Those comments can be interpreted as calling for regime change, that this is the beginning of an operation that will culminate with the collapse or the end of the Iranian regime. And I say that because of the way he addressed Iranians, saying that this is your moment, the new and bright future is ahead of you. This is about creating a new dynamic. This is not about trying to bring the Iranians to a nuclear negotiating table. It may have multiple phases to it. You know, the first phase may be to degrade and destroy Iran's ballistic capabilities and also to try to destroy its nuclear program or what remains of it and try to degrade and destroy its command and control structure over the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as well as the Iranian military. But in the president's comments, the most clear thing was that Iran is going to look very different once this war is over. That's according to the president. Whether they succeed or not is a different situation. But the president, I think, is signaling that there's going to be a different day after this military operation is over. And like I said, the only way to interpret that is the possibility of a regime change. That Iran could be defanged, it could have its ballistic missiles, its capabilities, its proxies destroyed in the region. A lot of that